Hello, everyone, and welcome. I can see quite a few of you all tuning in here today, and want to give you a chance to get yourself situated and get your sound connected. And then once you do that, it would be great if you could introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to know who you are, what's your Yale affiliation, and what made you decide to tune in today. So if you use that chat box to introduce yourself, that would be fantastic. Well, folks getting situated on Zoom. All the early birds are in the room. Welcome, everyone. Please do take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know your name, what your Yale affiliation is, and where you're zooming in from today. Hi, Billy. Nice to see you. Billy's always in some interesting country. Let's see where Billy is today. In Frankfurt. Wonderful. Good to see you here. Hi to Dwight Berry from Seattle, MFS 95 and data scientist in healthcare. And hi to Dave McMahon, who did my residency at Yale Medical School with a long-term interest in our climate. Hi to Craig Deutsche, class of 60, in LA. I edited an environmental journal for the Sierra Club dealing with desert issues. Wonderful. Hi to Nancy from New York, family member of Yale alums. Great to see you here. And Kyra Agnello. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. YSC class of 23, connecting from Lima, Peru. Interested in climate change, food security, and public health. All right. Maybe it's Chiara Agnello, I think.
Chiara Agnello, a former student of mine.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so Daniel knows. I think you win the class for most recent graduate, or you win the prize for most recent graduate. Yeah, nice to see you. Hi to Jeff Rubin, class of 82 from Wilsonville, Oregon. Geoscience, emergency management, emergency medical response. Nice. Hi to John from Las Vegas. Climate change is the big issue of our time. Well, we certainly think so, which is why we've been hosting these conversations. And I'll let folks continue to get logged in here. And as you do, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with our introduction. We're hearing today from Professor Daniel Carrión, who is an environmental health scientist focused on the intersection of climate, energy, and health equity and inequity. Daniel conducts exposure science and environmental epidemiology of ambient temperature and air pollution in the US and internationally. Broadly speaking, his goal is to understand the relationship between structural forms of inequality with exposure and health disparities to identify and support interventions. And more specifically, he's interested in the role of the home and neighborhood environments as opportunities for intervention toward climate and health equity, largely focused on energy transitions. Professor Carrión received his BA from Ithaca College, an MPH from New York Medical College, and his PhD from Columbia University, and did postdoctoral training at Mount Sinai at the Icahn School of Medicine. Beyond his research, Professor Carrión is Senior Fellow of the Agents of Change in Environmental Justice, Senior Fellow of the Environmental Leadership Program, Fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine, and a governor-appointed member of the New York State Minority Health Council. Welcome, Professor Carrión. We are delighted to have you with us today and looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much. Let me get this screen set up. Great. Hopefully you can all see that. So thank you very much for having me come speak to you all today. I'm excited to have a conversation after I share some of my research and thoughts. And apologies, I've been speaking a lot today, so if I get a frog in my throat, I'll just stop to drink some water. But that said, I'll be speaking to you today about this notion of double mitigation, exploring equitable climate change and health pathways, and how I think about this through the context of my own work. Yeah. So we all know that energy lies at the source of our current climate crisis. Societal decisions, historical decisions on where we derive energy, and how we use that energy are leading to the increasing global temperatures that we have been experiencing and will continue to experience into the future. But we run a dynamic tension here because energy is fundamental to human health. From the energy that we use to cook with, to the energy that we use to keep ourselves warm during the winter or cool during the summer, we need energy for population and human health. And I've been fortunate to work in all three of these spaces, but I'll mostly be focusing today on talking about energy demands for cooking and energy demands for cooling. Before I go any further, it seems like this crowd, I probably don't have to explain adaptation and mitigation, but just to make sure that there's no one left behind in the conversation, quickly to discuss this framework here, which is essentially just a plot to show that greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are driving climate change and global warming. The climate change that we are experiencing and will experience is having profound ecological and societal impacts. And we have two responses that we can have to those impacts. We can adapt to climate change. That is, we can look at the current changes and the projected changes and adjust society from the built environment to our organizational systems. We can adapt those to climate change, which is important and we should do. And in many parts of the world are already embarking upon those efforts. But we can't only adapt to climate change because we run the risk of creating a world that we fundamentally can't adapt to. Climate change in many projections will be such that no technology will avoid catastrophe. And so we also need to be thinking about mitigation. And mitigation are the activities that reduce greenhouse gas concentrations, both our emissions to future concentrations, as well as the activities that actually remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So I'm going to speak about my work from two different contexts of that work, which is one in Kintampo, Ghana, and the other one in the northeastern United States. And so I'll first talk about the context in Ghana. In Ghana, as in many parts of the world, there is a large proportion of individuals who rely on solid fuels for their cooking or heating needs. Reliance on solid fuels is generally referred to as energy poverty, and those solid fuels could include wood, dung, charcoal, amongst other solid and biomass fuels. And while the proportion of individuals in the population globally relying on these fuels is decreasing, the absolute counts are actually increasing, with the highest increases in sub-Saharan Africa. If you were to visit sub-Saharan Africa and visit many communities, this is the type of traditional stove that you would see being used. It's commonly referred to as the three-stone fire, which you can imagine is so called because there are three stones that prop up a pot, and underneath the solid fuel is combusted for cooking. And combustion of those biomass and solid fuels leads to a mixture of air pollutants that we collectively refer to as household air pollution. Household air pollution, as I mentioned, is a mixture including but not limited to carbon dioxide, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, amongst others. And these have negative impacts for the climate, but also for human health. So it's projected that approximately 2.3 million premature deaths take place each year due to exposure to household air pollution. And the largest proportion of those deaths are actually from lower respiratory infections. If you're familiar with the global health literature, lower respiratory infections are the leading killer of children under 5 globally, and that's pronounced in low and middle income countries. So anything that we can do to reduce the exposures that lead to this stark global health disparity can have a major benefit for human health and development. So the solution then is to scale up the use of other fuels like liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG for short, electric, induction, stoves, and other similar technologies. And in Ghana, as in many other countries, LPG represents one of the cheapest and most accessible options, as these other two options require stable and extensive electricity grids that simply currently don't exist in many parts of the world. But if you're unfamiliar with this literature, I would understand if some folks in the audience are confused about how using a fossil fuel can actually help us to fight climate change. So the atmospheric science behind this is complicated and a bit outside of the scope of my talk today. But rest assured that the International Panel on Climate Change indicates that activities consistent with the greenhouse gas emissions reductions needed to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius targets include clean cook stove transitions that are gas or electric based. And unfortunately, atmospheric projections of cook stove transitions haven't been conducted in Ghana, at least to my knowledge. But those done in Cameroon, which is in another part of West Africa, undergoing a similar LPG transition, are projected to have net cooling benefits, or that is, reduce future projections of climate change. So then this is the kind of framework that I use to think about this notion of energy poverty and its relationship to health. So poverty and or social inequality leads to energy poverty. Energy poverty, as I discussed earlier, leads to the production of household air pollution from the combustion of those solid fuels. And then household air pollution exposures are associated then with the various diseases and health outcomes that I mentioned. And so you can imagine then from a public health perspective that opportunities to intervene towards population health can then happen at one of these three arrows or nodes that I highlight here. So based on a moniker from the late Kirk Smith, a leader in this field, we can make the clean available. That is, we can identify interventions to increase the uptake of clean cook stoves like induction, LPG, etc. We can make the available clean. And this is meaning to say we can identify ways to reduce exposures when biomass combustion still takes place. That is, we can use improved cook stoves that increase ventilation, thereby improving combustion efficiency and hopefully reducing air pollution exposures. And then we can try to understand the biological pathways between exposure and the disease outcomes so that we can improve treatments and or public health interventions to interrupt this relationship between the exposure and the disease outcome. And my work has focused on these two nodes here that I've highlighted, the making the clean available and these biological pathways. So in order to do this work, I worked with the Ghana Randomized Air Pollution and Health Study. This is a collaboration between researchers in the US and in Ghana. And specifically, we worked in an area that I mentioned earlier, Kintampo, Ghana, which is a largely rural area of the country. And the team enrolled pregnant women and their newborn children and tracked them over time during pregnancy and then 1 year after birth. To understand various health outcomes, which I'll mention in a second. These are the primary cooks of the household, and they were all non-smokers. And these were over 1,400 parent-child pairs that were tracked. So this started off as a randomized control trial, a cluster randomized control trial. So essentially, individuals were randomized to either the control arm. So these are individuals who continued to use the traditional stoves. Other individuals who were randomized to use an improved gas or an improved solid biomass stove. So in this case, a stove that I mentioned has a chamber with ventilation that increases the efficiency of combustion. And then finally, an LPG stove. An LPG stove, liquefied petroleum gas, is much like the type of canister that you might use in your backyard grill, and then connected to these burners that you can cook on top of, clearly. And individuals were provided with free LPG fuel for the duration of the study so that that wasn't an impediment to their use of the stoves. And the primary outcomes of the study were pneumonia in the children and also low birth weight. Being an environmental health scientist, you can imagine that we also spent a lot of time thinking about the exposure measurement. So we tracked these individuals over time, looking at measures of carbon monoxide, but also of particulate matter at about 7 time points throughout the study period. So the first results that I'll mention here from some of my work were that of looking at microbial carriage. So I mentioned earlier that there are these relationships between household air pollution and childhood pneumonia. And so we wanted to try to use this as an opportunity to understand some of the potential etiology of these relationships. So what we did was when children were diagnosed with pneumonia, they were given a nasopharyngeal swab, a swab that was stuck up their nose to swab to try and capture what microbes might be causing that pneumonia. And then those individuals, we identified healthy controls to also swab around the same time points to also test for microbes. We found from some of this research that bacteria and not viruses were more abundant in the case amongst the cases, which leads us to believe that perhaps household air pollution is differentially operating on bacterial forms of pneumonia and potentially not viral forms of pneumonia. And when we looked at dose-response relationships between the environmental exposures and particular bacteria, we found that there were 3 particular bacteria that yielded significant relationships between the exposures and increased incidence of finding these bacteria. Later study using those same swabs and following those children later down the line at the age of 4, the team conducted spirometry testing, which is essentially lung function tests to see how children's lungs were developing over time. And what we found was that that children who had higher amounts of those microbial pathogens that I mentioned earlier were more likely to have hallmarks that were potentially indicative of poorer lung development in the future, in this case, in the context of increased airway resistance. We then looked at some of those microbes that I mentioned earlier, and we found that there is some suggestion that these results may indicate increased airway reactivity, which may be another pathway through which lung function is being impacted by these exposures. However, many of these studies are ongoing, and we're still working to understand how these exposures might be related to children's not only short-term and acute outcomes like lower respiratory infections, but also longer-term airway development, and if this actually rises to the point of clinical outcomes. So then I mentioned earlier that not only are we studying the impacts on health, but we know from the population-based epidemiological literature that these exposures are associated with vast health outcomes. And so while we can understand some of these more biological relationships, we can also do social science research to try and understand the pathways to support people moving towards the cleanest cooking alternatives. In this case, a study that I led, what we did was we created a framework to try and understand the reasons why people might stop using their LPG stoves. So in this study, for example, we created the suspended use framework. And what we did was we leveraged the fact that there were field workers in this study who were visiting these participants' homes on a weekly basis throughout the entirety of the study. And so this is almost 2 years worth of weekly visits for the 1,400 participants. And so what we did with that is that yielded, over 100,000 responses from these participants, which unfortunately, just because of the scale, is not appropriate for traditional qualitative methods. I being the lowly grad student who was responsible for this data analysis, wasn't able to weed through all of those responses by hand. And so instead, what I did was I used a form of natural language processing to create relationships or identify relationships between individual words in these responses, create typologies of responses to then try and get a sense of what the responses were broadly saying. And for LPG stoves, we found that individuals were likely to not use their LPG stove if the stove was either broken or at least the participant perceived that it was broken. And this makes total sense, right? These are LPG stoves that are, of course, combustible and therefore would be scary if someone perceived that it was broken. And so that was one of the findings. But another finding, which was more on the cultural side of things, was that around food quantity. So individuals in this region of the world made or make large pots of food that need to be pounded, essentially starches that need to be pounded. And so we found that when individuals were cooking these types of meals, they were less likely to do it on the LPG stove just because the stove itself wasn't big enough to support that activity. Other work that we did related to this, we used satellite remote sensing to try and understand relationships between availability of tree canopy as a potential driver of whether or not someone stopped using their stove, which might be intuitive because individuals have to go and collect their own firewood, largely speaking. So these are just some of the many findings from this work in Kintampo, Ghana. And now pivoting, I mentioned that I'm speaking about this from two different contexts. And so now I'm going to think about some of these climate, energy, and health relationships as it pertains to the northeastern United States. So within the US, we know that home energy accounts for approximately 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And half of those emissions are coming from heating and cooling demand. And so herein lies a real opportunity for energy efficiency and electrification as we think about these types of things. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then from the health side of things, we know that one of the ongoing challenges that we face as a society is around residential segregation. Residential segregation is really important to understand within this context because it represents the co-location of both environmental and social disparities. We know that research today shows that air pollution, extreme summertime temperatures, and energy insecurity are the most pronounced in Black and Latino communities in the US. And so I'll talk a little bit more about my double mitigation framework later, but broadly speaking, part of what I'm thinking about is how we can find leverage points that we can both make strides on mitigating climate change, but also on mitigating health disparities. Again, I'm sure many folks in the Zoom room are familiar with the pathways towards decarbonization, but to make sure we're on the same page, decarbonization pathways include energy efficiency and conservation measures because we need to reduce our overall energy demand in the first place to set us up for success with many of the other pivots we need for energy, including household and otherwise electrification. We need to electrify many of the end uses of energy so that when we decarbonize energy production, that is taking things like coal-fired power plants offline, every electron is coming from a source that is not producing greenhouse gases. And then this last piece, which I won't focus on today, is also important to think about nonetheless, which is that we need to reduce non-combustion forms of greenhouse gases that come from land use and land cover and agricultural types of sources. And one area of the nexus between climate and health that we really need to think about that also intersects with thinking about energy is around summertime temperatures. And so some of the work that I've done has been working with leaders in creating geospatial prediction models of environmental exposures. So in this study, what we did was we created one such model, reconstructing historical temperature at an hourly time step and at a kilometer grid cell throughout the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic United States, from the 13 states of Maine to Virginia. We used satellite remote sensing techniques as well as ground observations to then create this geospatial prediction model. And this is particularly relevant here because I'm showing here on this plot the temperature during a heat wave in New York City and the metro area at midnight from the hottest hour or the hottest evening hour of our data set. And what we see here is that there's vast spatial heterogeneity of temperature throughout this region, right? That we reconstruct a fair amount of differences in the temperature profiles in various parts of New York City and then the larger metro area. But if you were to compare our results to what the CDC uses for their heat and health tracking system, which is a NASA product called the NLDAS2 model, you would find that the NLDAS2 model, understandably, doesn't reconstruct a lot of this spatial heterogeneity, because what's happening is that these grid cells that I've overlaid are the spatial gradient, or the spatial resolution, I should say, of that NLDAS model. And what that means is that that NLDAS model would give you one value for this entire grid cell and one value for this entire grid cell, so on and so forth. And what you could see here is that we reconstruct substantial heterogeneity inside of those grid cells. And that maps onto when we look at the model performance. So when we look at the root mean squared error of our model versus that NLDAS2 model, we find that we have a much lower root mean squared error, which means that we have better prediction accuracy at ground observations. But then similarly, we have a third of the mean squared error of those NLDAS2 values. And this isn't simply a technocratic exercise. The reason why I care about this personally is because I think that this shows and this maps onto the spatial heterogeneity that we're able to then identify temperature disparities. So what we do is we looked at the social vulnerability index, which is a measure created by the CDC of social vulnerability. And we looked at the relationship between that social vulnerability index and temperature. There's a lot of literature to support that low-income households and communities of color are more likely to have higher summertime temperature exposures. And so we're proxying that in this case by looking social vulnerability, and we reconstruct a substantial gradient between the social vulnerability index and temperature. And this is just a visual depiction of those gradients, specifically in New York City versus in upstate New York. So then pivoting into my work thinking specifically about New York State, taking a lot of this inspiration, we know now that we can use these fine-scale temperature and satellite-derived models to understand temperature disparities in time and space. And so one of the things that I'm showing here is that we see different disparity estimates in different parts of the state. So the East Hudson and Mohawk Valley region, for example, which is here on the eastern side of New York. This is considered one climate region of New York State. You can see that Hispanic, Latino folks, Black folks, and Asian folks have substantially higher summertime temperature exposures when compared to white folks. But we don't see those same patterns in all parts of the state. So here showing you in the Adirondack Mountains, where we don't see that same disparity. And so herein lies the opportunity of trying to use some of these tools to pinpoint the locations where we can identify some of these disparities. Another disparity that we need to be thinking about is around energy insecurity. Energy insecurity is a social science framework that outlines the interplay between energy needs, financial constraints, and behavioral adaptations. So I think this is intuitive to most folks in what's often referred to as the heat or eat dilemma, right? What are the types of trade-offs that poor households are making during the winter to either keep themselves warm or potentially forego a nutritious meal? Or maybe individuals who are not re-upping prescriptions that they may need for chronic diseases and other types of precarious trade-offs. And I've been pushing in the literature for us to be thinking about what I refer to as an analogous heat stroke or go broke dilemma. What are the types of trade-offs that individuals are potentially making during summertime months to keep themselves cool? We've started to investigate some of these relationships using historical zip code level energy utilization data in New York State. And these are just some raw plots showing what summertime energy utilization looks like in based on the income of a zip code tabulation area, or I'll refer to as zip code moving forward. So unsurprisingly, at least for me, we can see that higher income zip codes consume more energy on average compared to lower income zip codes. But based on this notion of energy insecurity, one of the things that I've been curious about is if we see evidence of energy rationing. That is, if people are using different amounts of energy during the summertime months, even at equal temperatures. And at least based on this preliminary evidence, this is not peer-reviewed, but will hopefully be in the near future. Based on this evidence so far, we are identifying potential evidence of summertime energy rationing insofar as what we're seeing is that individuals at the top end of the energy distribution, if you are a high income zip code versus a low income zip code, you're using more energy for every degree of additional temperature than the lower income zip codes. And so this speaks to us about this possibility of energy rationing, which has been otherwise substantiated in the energy literature. So this was the inspiration, these three kind of pieces that I mentioned earlier around temperature disparities, social vulnerability, and evidence of energy rationing is the inspiration for a NASA proposal that I submitted and was awarded for around creating what we call the temperature and energy justice mapping tool. And the idea is that we are creating this as a feasibility study to see if we can identify that intersection that I mentioned earlier of areas that are experiencing localized temperature disparities, areas with heightened social vulnerability, and areas with evidence of energy rationing to see if we can support targeted energy efficiency upgrades throughout New York State. This is a partnership with the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, which is a nonprofit that's dedicated to making strides of making the home environment healthier for low-income communities of color. And you are some of the first people to actually get to see what the beta version of this tool is looking like so far. So still needs substantial work, but just to give you a sense of what we're working on, you can see these elements of heat index. So how hot an area feels is part of this tool. The land surface temperature, how hot the surface is. And then our proxies for energy rationing up here as well. And so just to give you a sense of what that might look like for one part of New York State, here zeroing in on Monroe County. This is the county that Rochester, New York is located in. You could see a quick demographic profile of Monroe County. You could see the summertime population weighted temperatures, the land surface temperatures. And then over here, a zip code map of the area of that county and our estimates of whether or not a zip code has more individuals who are potentially energy rationing than who aren't, evidenced by these different gradations. So I just took you on a whirlwind of a bunch of the research that I have been working on, but giving you some context and some thoughts about how I'm tying this together and thinking about some future directions. There's a lot of conversation around environmental justice and around climate justice, which is incredibly important, but this literature is rich and robust, and we need to maximize the perspectives and opportunities that are gleaned from those perspectives in this literature, insofar as justice not being just one thing. So the justice literature broadly breaks into recognitional justice, distributive justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice. So recognitional justice is quite simply just recognizing that there is a disparity and that there is some sort of underlying problem. One of my friends and colleagues, Diana Hernandez, often says that recognition is the first step towards justice. And so this is an important piece that we need here. Most of the environmental and climate justice literature focuses on distributive justice, which is looking at who receives the benefits and burdens of various environmental exposures, environmental harms, so on and so forth. And this is incredibly important, but on its own doesn't do anything to help us ameliorate these injustices. And so what I and others are trying to do is to push the justice literature to be thinking more about restorative justice. What are the types of opportunities that we have to improve conditions for those impacted and reorganize society to restore and improve health for those that are most disproportionately impacted? And this is important because the adaptation literature is important. It highlights that there are disproportionate impacts on various groups throughout the world. But what we know is that those disproportionate impacts are typically worsening fissures that already exist, but not creating those fissures, right? These inequalities are already pre-existing, and then climate change is just exacerbating those forms of inequality. So adaptation on its own doesn't necessarily advance health equity. So we need to be thinking about what I'm referring to as a double mitigation framework. We often talk about co-benefits of mitigation, but instead, I think we need to make these co-equal by saying double mitigation is the opportunity to decrease greenhouse gases, but also decrease health disparities. And only when we have both of those two things can we move towards equitable deep decarbonization. So there are many opportunities to study this, and some of this is ongoing. But there are many pieces of electrification, for example, that are happening in society. We know that electrification of cook stoves, of our forms of space heating and cooling, and how we heat our water are all opportunities for electrification. But what we need to ask is whether or not these are opportunities also for health mitigation or health disparities mitigation so that we can move towards health equity. And we know that there's some opportunity here because there's a rich and robust literature around nitrogen dioxide, for example, and childhood asthma. Childhood asthma is a very pronounced health disparity, with Black children having 1.5 times and Puerto Rican children having 2 times the asthma incidence compared to white children. So we know that there's an opportunity to both mitigate an exposure source that also improves a health disparity. But there are other pieces that we need to study to try and understand if there are other leverage points and other opportunity towards health equity. So in order to do this, this is quite simplistic, but just to give you a flavor of how we think about this, if we're thinking about an energy transition, we've often thought about these greenhouse gas reductions, but in order to disentangle whether or not that makes a stride on a health disparity, we need to first ask the question of whether or not co-pollutants, be they psychosocial or environmental exposures, are also decreasing with a decarbonization effort, and whether those are sufficient to yield improvements in health, so that we can then study those deep decarbonization pathways that are equitable. And we have a rich opportunity to do this, right? We know that the Inflation Reduction Act represents a vast movement in society towards decarbonization, in the way of energy efficiency and electrification. So we have an opportunity to study this real time as researchers to try and make sure that these are actually yielding improvements towards health and to inform policies real time. And so I'll make another small pivot here just to mention that these are amongst the many things that we're thinking at the School of Public Health. And in one context, through our MPH concentration, we have a class called the Clinic in Climate Justice, Law, and Public Health. And this is really an opportunity to engage with community stakeholders and other stakeholders that otherwise may not have the research expertise on staff or enough individuals to dedicate towards these questions, but that have really grounded research questions that we as researchers and burgeoning leaders in climate change and public health, the students that is, can help inform some of the efforts of community engaged work. And so these are just some of the many partners that we've worked with trying to think about these opportunities towards climate and health equity. And finally, some of my own related work, aside from my educational work, is how we can think about things like residential segregation as an upstream driver of not only temperature disparities, but many of our environmental exposures. There's a rich and robust literature from demography and sociology quantifying segregation, and we can use that to leverage and understand exposure disparities. We can also try to understand energy poverty alleviation programs or energy insecurity alleviation programs, like the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, to see if these offer opportunities to buffer the impacts of things like extreme heat for low-income households. And then we could also think about housing policies as pathways towards environmental health equity, which is some work that we've been doing, thinking specifically in Connecticut and potential desegregation pathways towards improving environmental health equity. So, of course, none of this type of work is possible without an amazing team. So these are just some of the many folks who are working with me to make all of this happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Carrión. Really fascinating presentation. And I love the fact that, the research you presented is so fresh. It sounds like it's still evolving as we speak. So it's really nice to be front and center with such a salient project. I want to invite those of you in the audience, if you have questions, that you can post your questions in the Q&A box. If you put it in the Q&A box rather than in the chat, it's very helpful because it allows me to do a better job of keeping track of the questions. And so I'd like to start with James Mann, who did put a question in the chat. That's okay, I got it. With your high income benchmark being $90,000, what portion of the household incomes fall above that level? This raises the question of whether the income categories need to be expanded in number in order to gain a better understanding of the impacts according to income cohorts.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And thank you for that suggestion. It's absolutely true. One of the things that we do in a study like this is we often will try breaking up the categories in many different ways to see if that influences our final results. And so far, breaking up the categorization system hasn't really changed our interpretation, but nonetheless is absolutely important. We're also kind of limited by the binning that the census does. And so the levels that the census gives us those categories is kind of the smallest we can go. And so that's another piece there. But yeah, absolutely great point.
I was going to follow that up with a question about age demographics because, just in our popular media, whenever we hear about sort of people being too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter, we hear about it more in terms of, thinking about older people who are on fixed incomes and their ability to pay for services that put them in the pathway of good energy outcomes. And we don't think about it as well. We don't certainly don't hear about it in terms of race demographics as much. So I just wonder if your research breaks it out in that way. To what extent does this also look like a crisis that disproportionately affects older people?
Yeah, and absolutely to your point, older folks, particularly if they are retired, have to deal with fixed incomes and therefore may be more likely to be making some of these trade-offs, and with higher levels of chronic conditions. Unfortunately, that's something in a study like this that we're really limited to be able to look at just because zip code tabulation areas are so geographically large that we wouldn't have lots of differences between those zip code tabulations in the age demographics. And so that's one area that we're kind of limited in a study like this, but absolutely a great point.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to a question that sort of you named some of the others who are involved in your research, and you are a part of a cohort of 7 speakers in our climate change conversations series. So I want to refer to Kai Chen's presentation because there were a number of people during that presentation that brought up the expansion of Tweed Airport in East Haven, very close to home for us at Yale. And the warning to FAA officials regarding the potential effects on the local community. This is a really hotly debated topic in and around New Haven now. East Haven being a community that is large, has a large both African American, people of African descent, and Latino population. And we're just wondering, how do policymakers balance the need of expanding communities like New Haven with the health disparities and the potential exposure to pollution of neighboring communities like East Haven?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not incredibly up to date on that situation, but to your point, one of the things that we can do as environmental epidemiologists, one of our uh, tools in our toolbox are what are called health impact assessments. And so I don't know if that's been the case for Tweed, but it is possible to do something like a health impact assessment to say, okay, what does it mean to expand this airport with regard to noise exposures, with regard to air pollution exposures, whatever the kind of adverse concerns that may arise from that, we can create those estimates of those potential increases in the environmental harms. And then we can use established dose response relationships in the epidemiological literature to say, how many more of X outcomes would we expect from increases to those exposures? And then, folks like health economists can take those results and say, okay, cost benefit analysis now, what does that mean for making this decision, and how do you leverage that within a policy decision making framework? So that might be just one way that I, as someone steeped in the epidemiological literature, would think about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned policy because that's where I was gonna sort of uh, come back with that question is thinking about the policy implications of the research that you're producing. And, I know that there are, it's often the case with Yale professors that the research that you produce can drive policy, particularly if it's part of the agenda. And I know with something like an airport expansion, there's data that also tells us that living near an airport. I recall seeing this research. You'll be probably more familiar with it than I am. But living near an airport, one of the health outcomes that it has is just shortening the lifespan. There's some kind of a relationship there where people who live in a direct flyover path of an airport seem to have shorter lifespans. And so I was just wondering if to your point about policy, if you have a sense of direction that you're going in with your research toward policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm trying to think about my work in a few different ways to try and inform policy. And I'm also trying to be involved in the policy process in a few different ways. So speaking to the latter piece first, one of the things that I do outside of my kind of academic research and education work is that I sit on the Minority Health Council and Health Equity Council for New York State. And the goal there is for me to really try to bring the research voice and the voice of someone who's thinking about environmental health disparities on a day-to-day, to try to bring that to the leaders of the New York State Health Department to try and influence how they do things and what can make, New York State more health equitable. Um, but with regard to my actual research, part of what I'm doing at the moment, I mentioned a project on residential segregation that I'm working on. And one of the ways that I'm thinking about this is that Connecticut actually has historically had efforts to try and desegregate the state. They haven't worked largely. We know that society, for example, we are more segregated now than we were in 1990, right? We made strides before 1990, and then since then it's only gotten worse. And so one of the things that my team and I are trying to do is to try and say, okay, here's this policy that's on the books, but doesn't have any teeth behind it. Can we simulate a world where everyone in the state, where all of the townships in the state actually satisfied this policy? And what does that mean for lives saved every year, right? And so part of that then is just really finding the really policy relevant questions, right? What is an unanswered question that can tack straight on to a piece of legislation, so that we can then create research that hopefully is more impactful. Uh, I feel like it'll be some years away before we know if it's actually impactful, but that's at least my theory of change with regard to that. But then in other work that I've done, for example, the work in Ghana, we worked with the Kintampo Health Research Center, which is part of the Ministry of Health in Ghana. And the real opportunity there is that those were folks who were clued in to what was going on in terms of the governmental proceedings throughout Ghana. And so we were able to do evaluations of government-led energy efforts to say whether or not those efforts were actually bearing the fruit that they were trying to work towards, right? And so the goal there is to really inform the activities of governments so that they can fine-tune their efforts towards health outcomes. So I feel like that was a long response, but hopefully just a few of the different ways I think about this.
No, really helpful. I mean, this stuff is great in the academic sphere, but the reality of it is that it's meant to actually impact people's lives, right? So it's nice to hear your thoughts about the directions that you're going in with it. You mentioned Ghana, and so I want to go to Tim's question. What progress is being made in rural electrification in Africa, and to what extent are renewable versus fossil fuel energy resources being utilized?
Yeah, so it's absolutely a mixed bag in that context. There are strides towards rural electrification, but as you can imagine, it's mostly starting from urban cores and moving lines further and further out. And so there are many rural areas that may have some electricity, but that it comes and goes. Uh, and so at the moment, many of those places in the most rural parts of the country either don't have electricity, or if they do, it's unreliable. Um, and so fossil fuels and solid fuels are absolutely one of the largest sources of energy in those rural parts of the country. Um, so yeah, and I think there's some additional context here insofar as Ghana some years ago uh, found oil offshore, and so has started to produce some of its own oil, and LPG being a byproduct of the oil refinery process. It represents kind of, at least in the country's perspective, a win-win for them with regard to having an outlet for this LPG that also can improve health outcomes.
Okay, I want to go to Sarah's question. Have you or will you research the health improvement potential compared to the climate mitigation potential to help prioritize levers? And she gives the example of health improvement potential in, I'm sorry because I don't know the acronyms, but DALY compared to climate mitigation potential in kilograms of CO2.
So DALYs, or disability adjusted life years, is a metric that we use to both summarize mortality, but also morbidity impacts of an exposure. And so it's a way of summarizing exposure outcome relationships for many different outcomes. Um, and yeah, that's a great point and a great question. I currently am not doing work that's working on using the quantification of DALYs with CO2 equivalents, but one area that I am trying to think about relatedly are these notions of years of life lost. These are estimates of how premature a mortality was. And this is really relevant when we're thinking about health disparities, because we know that communities of color are not only dying in higher amounts, but also at younger ages. We've seen this very much be the case with COVID, for example, where the most pronounced health disparities are after you do age adjustment for the differences in age structures by ethno-racial group. And so absolutely, we need these types of summary measures. Um, the kind of difficulty then becomes, though, is, what outlet for which group, right? Because when you say DALYs, not only did I have to define what a DALY was, but then I have to just define the summarization that happened to get to the DALY. And so that may work in the context of policy, but that's not great in the context of the type of community engaged work that I do. And so, trying to pick which metrics are for which populations that we're working with are also a really important part of doing this type of research. I had a conversation with Dave Chosky, who is the former commissioner of health for New York City. And, I had mentioned this notion of years of life lost. And he said, but that doesn't mean anything to the community. But maybe if you said something like happy birthdays unsung, that would mean something. And so that was a moment, we have to reintroduce emotion into this work because we're here for a reason. We're here to make people's lives better. And so trying to think about when we use these various metrics and for which groups is really important.
We had a presentation in one of our earlier conversations that was about climate change communication and how you talk to, how we talk to our colleagues and various advocacy groups about climate change in persuasive ways. And that was, I think, one of the biggest points that was made was the use of storytelling and connecting it to something that people can relate to on a personal and human level can be a lot more effective and from the community perspective and even from the one-on-one perspective than sort of more analytical metrics. And I wanted to follow that up by just asking about measuring outcomes in terms of cost to society. I mean, and I'm curious whether there's a comparison that can be made between some of the research you cited from Ghana and communities of color in the US. Obviously, if you have children becoming sick with pneumonia, you have groups of people dying at much younger ages, there's a cost, there's a financial number that can be assigned to that, whether it's the cost of their medical care or the cost of lost output as a member of society. And I just wonder if there's any sort of quantifications that you look at with regard to those kind of outcomes.
I don't personally. This is, there is the entire field of health economics that really delves into this because there are so many assumptions that get baked into how we value all of these different components that are really important. And I think, there is an example here that is one of the reasons why people in climate and health run away from this type of question, which is that in one of the former, I believe, IPCC reports, there were quantifications of impacts on health that used a measure called the value of a statistical life, and VSL for short. And so the VSL basically just tries to account for there are these disparate impacts, and then how do we add up those impacts? But what you use to quantify is a bit subjective. And one of the pieces that went into that was they used different quantifications for different countries. And so the implication then from that, this is not what people intended to do, but this is what people interpreted, that people's lives were valued differently in different parts of the world. And so for people like me who don't have training in that area, that takes a lot of really intentional thought about how we do these types of quantifications that I personally have not been trained in, and in the short run, I'm not working on.
That's very interesting point and helpful to hear your thoughts about it. because I know these are questions that all of us have, and we're not experts like, well, some of us are experts like you, but not all of us are. And so hearing the boundaries of the different disciplines of research is also really helpful to sort of understand how they all work together. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to go to a final question from Chris, looking at renewable sources of energy. So we know, we've all sort of heard the news that we should be buying electric vehicles or planning to. We should be looking at solar panels for our homes. But then at the same time, not everyone can afford to buy a new vehicle. Not everyone can afford to be in a home where they can have solar, or some people who are renting, don't really have any control over that. So Chris's question is, what steps can we take to ensure that these kinds of advancements mitigate disparities in energy and security and transportation instead of sort of increasing those disparities?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that we need to keep our eye on as a society and push for policies, I think starting at the local level to make sure we're making strides. So New York City, where I live, is one area that we really need to be making pushes here, because there's a high proportion of individuals who rent, and because the housing stock is so old, that it will be more expensive to make these types of upgrades than the Inflation Reduction Act or other similar policies afford. And so we really need to be pushing on local policymakers to identify these leverage points to try and make sure we're not seeing worsening fissures with these types of disparities. There are analyses that have been done, I believe, even here at YSE, looking at the adoption of solar. And they found that in California, where there were rebates for solar adoption, that there was still a disparity in the areas that adopted more solar, even after accounting for income. But one of the pieces that was kind of missing there from my perspective was that that's not adjusting for differences in wealth. We know that you can have two groups, let's say Black folks and white folks, for example. You can have equal income comparisons, but the wealth distribution is even more pronounced as a disparity than the income disparity. And wealth is what people are usually tapping from to make household upgrades. And so if we're not keeping our eye on all of these different ranges of disparities and the depth of all of these disparities, then we will only continue to create new disparities. I think I gave you a classic researcher answer, which is that we need lots of information and lots of data to try and keep our eyes on this, but we also need to be regularly meeting with policymakers to make pushes to make these equitable.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and for this really fascinating presentation and for all the work that you're doing on these issues. I certainly think that we're all a bit more enlightened on the things that we read about in the papers and the policies that are being discussed on a daily basis in a variety of forums that we're exposed to. So very grateful to you for being here today. I will give the last word to you if there's anything you would like to say in closing.
No, nothing in particular. This always a pleasure to get to chat with folks and share some of these thoughts, and really thankful for you all being here and your questions. They were definitely stimulating to me as well.
All right, well, I encourage everyone to tune in to the last of our climate change conversations series happening tomorrow at the same time, 4 o'clock. And you can always view these on demand. The presentations will be made available on the Yale Alumni Academy website after the climate change conversation series is over. Have a great day, everyone. And thank you again, Professor Carrión. Bye-bye.